Hello, I'm Felicity Rican, and today we'll be taking a brief look at some key issues related to assessment in mathematics. Today we're at Libra Primary School in Lenasia, where Mrs. Gianni will be assessing her learners while measuring capacity. But first, let's speak to Suzanne van Ryswyk from the Maths Workshop on the National Revised Curriculum Statement's expectations in regards to assessment.
Assessment is an integral part of the whole learning and teaching cycle. It's not an add-on, something that you do after you've finished your teaching. Outcomes-based education is one of the key principles of Curriculum 2005. And the whole learning and teaching and assessment cycle revolves around outcomes, hence the name outcomes-based education. So if we have a look at this diagram here, we can see that you start your learning experience with the planning. What outcomes do you want learners to have achieved by the end of the learning experience? In other words, what are you going to assess at the end of the learning experience? Based on that, you plan your learning and teaching. What will the learners do to achieve the outcomes? And then, how will you assess whether they are achieving the outcomes or whether at the end of the experience they have already achieved the outcomes? This is an ongoing cycle. So obviously sometimes your assessment feeds back into your learning and teaching. If they're not achieving, how are you going to change your teaching methodology, for example? But as you can see, the most important thing that really we need to understand, you don't plan to teach and then decide later what are you going to assess. You plan around the assessment in the first place.
Where do we find the outcomes that learners must achieve?
Directly from the curriculum, Felicity. The RNCS, Mathematics Curriculum Statement, is broken up into 5 learning outcomes. And as you can hear from the name, they are the learning outcomes that learners must achieve by the end of the band, the General Education and Training band. But now each of those learning outcomes is broken up in turn into assessment standards. Those are the measurables, the things that you are going to assess. Can a learner do this? And then each assessment standard is made up of both skills and knowledge, what the learners will know and what they must be able to do at the same time with that knowledge. And those pieces of knowledge and skills in each assessment standard are the outcomes that you are going to assess as a teacher.
Now today I'm going to be assessing you to see if you can estimate, measure and record capacity. Now remember, you will each estimate the capacity of each part, measure it and record it. Now each person will have to estimate the measurements of the 3 pots. Now remember, capacity is always measured in milliliters and liters. So in the answers, make sure that you write your answers in milliliters or liters. Now I have a worksheet for you. Now, on the first column, you have to write your estimation. So you first look at the container and you estimate, and then you write your answer. And then on the second column, now you have to do the actual measurement, and then you record your answer. Now, when you finish measuring all the containers in front of you, then you will do the self-assessment. You know how to assess yourself, whether you can estimate or you can measure or you need help. So you will tick in the appropriate block. Okay?
Yes, ma'am.
Could you please describe the task you've given the learners?
I've given them a worksheet where they will have to estimate the capacity of different pots and record it. And when they finish estimating, now they have to do the actual measurement and do the recording using the correct units, milliliters and liters. And when they're done with that part, then they'll have to assess themselves, do the self-assessment.
Estimates, measures, records, compares and orders 2-dimensional shapes and 3-dimensional objects using SI units with appropriate precision. For mass, using grams and kilograms, capacity using milliliters and liters, length using millimeters, centimeters, meters and kilometers. Many teachers would say this assessment standard is about mass, capacity or length. So they plan a lesson on mass, capacity or length. And of course you'd be correct to do this. But this is not the whole assessment standard. It is only the knowledge part of it. You cannot separate the knowledge from the skills. The assessment standard is saying that learners must not just know that capacity, for example, is measured in liters and millimeters and be able to explain what liters and millimeters are, They also must be able to use that knowledge to estimate the capacity of something, to measure the capacity of something, to record capacity, to compare the capacity of 2 or more containers, and to order the capacity of 2 or more amounts. So there are 5 skills mentioned here related to capacity. You cannot say your learners have achieved competency in this assessment standard unless they have acquired all these skills with each one of the knowledge components: mass, capacity, and length. So therefore, you must assess each of the skills with mass, with capacity, and with length. Before you design your assessment, you must be clear on exactly which skill as well as which knowledge you are assessing. Which brings us to the next key point, which Suzanne van Ryswyk pointed out. Not all skills can be assessed in writing. For example, to assess if a learner can measure the capacity of a container, you actually need to give the learners a chance to measure the container's capacity. You can't just ask them to describe what they were doing in theory. You need to see if the learners have the skills that are needed. The teacher is busy assessing whether the learners can measure capacity using milliliters or liters. She's already spent some lessons on teaching this topic. Rachel, you told me earlier you've been teaching capacity as described in 2 assessment standards. Which 2? And did you teach the whole of those 2 assessment standards or just parts of them?
It's Assessment Standard 5 and Assessment Standard 7, which talks about estimating, measuring, recording capacity, and using appropriate instruments in relation to capacity. I did not teach the whole assessment standards, I only taught part of them.
And what were you busy assessing right now?
I'm assessing if my learners can estimate capacity, measure capacity, and record it using the correct units, milliliters, and liters.
In today's lesson, the teacher pointed out that she was assessing only part of an assessment standard. Is that because it was a very long one, or should we be breaking up all the assessment standards into different lessons?
The teacher was absolutely right. One assessment standard does not mean one lesson or one assessment activity at all. We must break down each and every assessment standard into, first of all, its skills and its knowledge, and we're going to assess both the skills and the knowledge. So in other words, if learners must understand what a fraction is, we're going to assess, in theory, do they understand or know what a fraction is? But then the skill might be comparing fractions or converting fractions, so we must assess the skill as well. So the first thing that she will obviously have decided in that assessment is she assessing knowledge or is she assessing skills? The next thing I can say on that is that each assessment standard can also be broken down into its different levels of complexity. So while there might just be one sentence, we will know as teachers that there are all sorts of things that you have to be able to do before you can achieve the total outcome. I can give you an example of that from the curriculum. We have in Learning Outcome 1, the first assessment standard is that learners will be able to count forwards and backwards in certain intervals, including 2s, 3s, 5s, 10s, 25s, 50s, and 100s, I think it is. Now, that's the assessment standard, but first of all, there are 2 skills there. They must be able to count forwards, and they must be able to count backwards. Those are 2 separate skills. And then each of the intervals is different knowledge. They must know their intervals of 2, 3, 5, and so on. So you've got 7 pieces of knowledge and 2 skills. In other words, you could be assessing 14 different things. Obviously, some are quite easy. You can assess them at the same time, but not necessarily. You may have in that assessment standard 14 lessons, 14 assessment activities. If I take that same example, that same assessment standard, how you might be able to break it up, for example, we have 4 terms. Maybe we will do the same assessment standard over 4 terms. In the first term, we'll do counting forwards and backwards in the easiest intervals. That's probably 10s and 100s. In the second term, we'll count forwards and backwards in 2s and 5s. And then in the third term, we'll do maybe 25s and 50s. And then in the fourth term, we can count in intervals of 3 and any others that the teacher wants to add, because of course the assessment standards are just the minimum learners must achieve. They aren't prescriptive, they aren't the limit.
We hear a lot about rubrics whenever the topic of assessment comes up. What exactly is a rubric?
A rubric, Felicity, is simply a marking grid which shows the different levels of achievement and then a description of what a learner must do to get that level of achievement. So if, for example, a teacher says to me, you can get 10 marks for this question, I need to know, what must I do to get the full 10 marks? What must I do to only get 8 marks or to get 5 marks? And so we write out for each of those. I have some examples I can show you. You can see in this top one, those are the codes shown in the national documents. You can see that a learner has satisfied the requirements is one of the levels, and then has only partially satisfied the requirements, has not satisfied the requirements at all, or has exceeded the requirements. Those are not prescribed. Teachers can write their own rubrics with their own headings. They don't even have to use 4 levels. You can use more or less than 4 levels. So very popular is to say that a learner is competent, or they are approaching competence, they're not yet competent, or they are more than competent. Personally, I like to use a nice simple one, which is just the learner can do this assessment standard or this task. They can do it only with support, they can't do it, or they can do even more than that. But the key thing is that what the teacher would now have to do is to write, in order to say someone can do this, what must they show? What must they actually do to achieve each one of these 4 levels now? Most people really like numbers, and so generally 1 is your lowest level of achievement. If you can't do it, it's a level 1, and normally 4 will be your exceeded the expectations. Rubrics are best used for open-ended questions. They are almost essential for projects, assignments which are made up of more than one task, and investigations. When they should not be used is closed questions, i.e. questions which have just got one answer. And for the kind of daily drills, exercises, here are 10 sums, do that, you won't use a rubric for that sort of thing. If possible, use an even number of levels. In other words, either have a grid with 4 levels or with 6 levels. The reason being that when we have an odd number like 3 levels or 5 levels, it's very tempting to put most learners into the middle one, the average one, and then we kind of get this 80% of the class is average. As teachers, we need to decide on what side of competence is the learner, not yet quite competent or basically competent. And by using an even number, you're forcing yourself to put people one side or another.
Using the assessment standard of counting forwards and backwards as an example, could you show us a simple way of drawing up a rubric?
Yes, I can. I have an example here that I can show you. The easiest thing is normally to start with the level of essential achievement. So if we're saying a learner can do this, what does that mean? So in that example I gave you, let's say we're just assessing now, can learners count forwards and backwards in tens? Then I will say can do. In other words, they've achieved. I will say the learner can count forwards and backwards in tens, starting at any number. That's quite important because in the foundation phase, they were only expected to be able to count starting on the multiple. But for example, to say someone can count backwards in tens, I should be able to say count backwards in tens starting at 531. I don't have to start on a multiple of 10. Then I will say, okay, if a learner is sort of there but not quite, what might they do to get that level of achievement that says they can do it with support? Either they perhaps need some kind of aid to help them, such as a number line or some counters, or perhaps they need the teacher or a friend to help them get started, and once they're started they're okay. Or perhaps they can count forwards in tens but they can't yet count backwards in tens. Any of those, they're on the road, they're not quite there. I will write, as you can see, my description. That's what you must do to get a can do with support. A learner who cannot count in tens at all, or who can only count forwards and backwards starting on a multiple of 10, I'm going to say they are only a level 1 or a cannot do at this stage, because in foundation phase they counted forwards and backwards on the multiple of 10. It's not okay for grade 4, they got to move beyond that now. Finally, that leaves me with going to the other side. I look at my can do again and say, well, what would I expect of a learner if they can actually do more than that? There's nothing in the assessment standard that says it must be done mentally, so I would have accepted it if a learner could do this written. But if they can count forwards and backwards in tens mentally, starting at any number, I will say that's can do more, because mental maths we know is a bit higher of a skill than written maths.
Before we say goodbye, let's go check in with Rachel Gianni and see if today's assessment was successful. Would you say you know more now about how skilled your learners are in measuring capacity than you would have from a written test?
I will say it was very successful because now I know exactly what each learner can do, and if there are learners that need assistance, I exactly know which learner needs assistance in which area. Whereas if I had given them a written test, that would never have given me the correct insight into each learner.
If you had given new teachers some tips on assessment, what are the most important one or two things that you would say to her?
Firstly, I will say planning for assessment is very important. You must know what skills, knowledge, values, and attitudes that you're going to assess. And also it is important that you tell your learners what you're going to assess them so that they know what is expected of them. And secondly, I will say the purpose of assessment is also important. You must know why you are assessing. Are you assessing for baseline or for diagnostic or summative or formative?
Ms. Gianni, thank you very much for allowing us into your class today and sharing this activity with us. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Well, that's all we have for today. Thanks for joining us and see you in the next episode where we'll be investigating resources in a maths classroom.